Um, Thank you, everyone, for coming here tonight. And this story is about Ben. Some of you, I think, were here earlier today and might know the kind of outline of Ben's story. For those of you who weren't at the law school earlier today, my questions will have a little bit of context, just so people can follow what's going on with the narrative. But the first thing I want to ask Ben is, can you just tell us a little bit about who you were in March of 1987?
March of 1987, I was a young man at the age of 22, recently married January 10th, 1987. Wife and I were expecting our first child. I was working, doing pretty good in life. Both my wife and I had jobs, and we had 2 cars, and we were doing pretty good ourselves, excuse me. But that was me back in 87.
Yes, so just a little bit of context here. On March 22nd, 1987, in Dallas, there was a young man, a 33-year-old man named Jeffrey Young, and he went to work on a Sunday night. That was a Sunday night. He had clients. He ran a clothing import company, and he had clients in Asia, so that was their Monday morning. He would often go in on Sunday night. We don't know exactly what happened, but because there were no cameras there, video, nothing, no one was there to witness this. But what the police believe happened is that around 9:30 at night, 2 men, maybe 1 man, but 2 men, came to this office. Now, this office was in the warehouse district of Dallas, so it was a little isolated on a Sunday night. 2 men came in, saw Jeffrey Young come out of the house, out of his office. They rushed at him. They pushed him back into the office. They took his wedding ring off, his Seiko watch off. They took the cash. They took what was called a jam box, or a portable TV radio. And then they hit him over the head 5 times with a blunt instrument. They probably hit him more than 5 times. They cracked his head in 5 places. They picked him up. They carried him down the stairs. They opened the trunk of Jeffrey Young's BMW. They put him in the trunk of the car. They slammed down the trunk, drove over the Trinity River into the poor black neighborhood of West Dallas, which at that point was dangerous because of the crack epidemic. Somehow Jeffrey Young was able to reach for a lever in the trunk and somehow able to get out onto the street and fell on Puget Street. And there he lay, dying, bleeding, shaking, as a small crowd surrounded him. The perpetrators, we think, looked back, saw that Jeffrey Young, the victim, had gotten out of the car, panicked, drove the BMW into an alley, and ran away. At 3:05 that morning, Jeffrey Young died, so the assault and robbery situation became a murder investigation. So on March 22nd, let me just tell you one other point. The next day, March 23rd, the police and detectives went all around West Dallas trying to find out if anyone had seen the perpetrators, if anyone had seen anything, so that they could find the people. And everyone said no. And then a $35,000 reward, a $25,000 reward from Ross Perot, who was a big man in Texas, about to run for president, and $10,000 from the company of the victim. They offered a reward, $35,000 out there. Suddenly, 3 people came forward and said that they saw the 2 men running away from the BMW, and they knew exactly who it was. Tell us about March 26, 1987.
March 26, 1987, I was shortly after taking my wife lunch around about 11:30, 12 o'clock. I had went to, on my way back to the house, I was approached or flagged down by this guy by the name of Charles Stewart, and he had asked for a ride for me to follow him to his girlfriend's job so he could drop her car off, and he needed a ride back to his house, so I agreed to do so. And I told him to come over to my house about 2:30, and I would take him. So upon arriving at home, I had been dealing with these migraine headaches for like 3 days, and so I went home and took a Tylenol, laid down, went to sleep. I was awakened by someone beating at the door, so I woke up, looked at the clock, it was 2:30, so I assumed it was Charles Stewart coming to get me to follow him to his girlfriend's job. As I was approaching the front door, I could see out the front window that there was a mass amount of police cars, presence in the front yard. Opened the front door, investigator, uniformed cops, standing on the porch, asked for ID. I handed my ID, and upon looking at my ID, he told me to turn around, face the wall. I was being placed under arrest, and I asked him for what for. He said, "I'll tell you in a minute." So after searching me and placing handcuffs on me, he took me to his squad car, placed me in the back seat, got in the front seat, and looked over the seat and said, "You know the white guy they found on the street the other day?" I said, "I heard that they found someone on the street the other day." He said, "Well, you're under arrest for his murder." I said, "Well, you got the wrong guy. It's not me." He said, "Well, you have some neighbors in the neighborhood claim that they saw you on the night of the offense walking around in the neighborhood showing off this TV jam box." And I'm like, man, dope fiends do stuff like that. I'm not a dope fiend. I have 2 cars. Both my cars have systems in it. And I have a system in the house. I don't do any walking, so no one saw me with a jam box showing it off that night. And he was like, "Well, that's what they say." And asked me for permission if I would agree to them searching my house. And of course, I signed a waiver of consent. They went into the house, searched, found a portable TV radio, and they were like, "Oh, we got you now." And I was like, "Listen, I don't know what you're looking for, but I can assure you that's not it." I said, "There's nothing in this house that's stolen or belonged to anyone else other than someone who lives here." And so upon identifying the TV, they realized it was engraved with my mother's name and driver's license number, so they put it down and said, "Well, we still have to take you downtown for questioning." So I was taken downtown for questioning, and then upon questioning, of course, I'm innocent of these charges, so I feel it's in my best interest to, cooperate with the police and tell them everything I had done that Sunday, in hopes that they'd realize they have the wrong person. So I'm telling them what I did that Sunday from morning to night. And he said, "Well, seems that someone saw your car parked in front of this lady named Miss Gladys's house." I said, "Well, sure, my car was parked there." I said, at that time I was next door talking to this young lady who lives next door. And of course I had told him I had a job. There's no way I'm going to go out and commit a crime such as this for something so petty as a jam box, something that on the streets you couldn't get maybe $20 or $30 for. So they sent an investigator to talk to the young lady I was with the night of the offense, as well as sent someone to my place of employment, which was Mistletoe Express at the time. And they returned and said, "Well, the girl said she doesn't have a boyfriend." I said, "I never told you I was her boyfriend. I told you I was with her." He said, "Well, she says she don't know you. And the people at Mistletoe Express say they've never heard of you as well." I said, "Well, I can't understand that because I was with this young lady. So surely she knows who I am. And surely the people at Mistletoe Express know me because that's where I work." He said, "Well, they say they don't know you." So long story short, I was placed in jail, arraigned, and charged with capital murder at that time.
Just a little bit of context. Ben's story is not unusual. Since 1989, there have been 3,600 cases of wrongful convictions. And there are certain commonalities in what we see. We see lying eyewitnesses or mistaken eyewitnesses. In this case, there was a jailhouse informant who told the police that Ben had confessed to him. The police needed that information because they had nothing to connect Ben to the assault. Even if he was getting out of the car, which he wasn't, even if he was getting out of the car, there was nothing to connect him to the assault. So they needed that jailhouse informant to connect those 2 dots. There was police tunnel vision, which is when a police officer or police or prosecutors decide, you know what, we think it's that guy, and they focus on Ben Spencer to the exclusion of any other more viable suspect. In fact, 2 people told the police that it was another man, Michael Hubbard, and it was not Ben. But the police already had their man in custody, and so, you know, that was it. They went on with it. And then there was, and you'll hear about this in a second, there was prosecutorial misconduct where the prosecutor hid crucial evidence that could have undermined their case. This happens all the time. Brady violations happen all the time. So Ben, knowing kind of all of this happened, knowing how easy it is to convict an innocent person and impossible to get him out, you went to trial in October of 1987. What happened? Short, you know, kind of briefly, what happened?
October 1987 was the first trial. As I said, I was initially charged with capital murder. The state elected to try me for murder as opposed to capital murder, which would have been a huge hurdle for them to prove. And so I was tried and subsequently convicted of murder, sentenced by a jury of 12 to 35 years, non-aggravated. And under Texas law, if a sentence is aggravated, you have to do a larger amount of time on it. So with a non-aggravated 35-year sentence, I could have did anywhere from 4 to 5 years and been eligible for parole.
But that conviction was vacated, and here's the serendipity of it. A lot of times, just getting an innocent person out of prison requires unbelievable luck. Just one lucky break after another. He's the luckiest of the unlucky. So what happened is, you know, the jury was deciding the sentence. They had already convicted him, and Ben's lawyer looked over to the prosecutor's table and saw a piece of paper. And the piece of paper was a Crime Stoppers report, which showed that their star witness, Gladys Oliver, had received $580 for her testimony, for the information she gave. Now, that's not much money, but she had lied about it on the stand. And that was information that the defense could have used to impeach her credibility. So he takes it to the judge and says, you know, the star witness lied on the stand. And so they decided, okay, we're going to vacate the conviction, and then you were given a choice.
So after being convicted, and one of the attorneys filed a motion for a new trial, which the judge agreed and granted. 3 days prior to my second trial beginning, I was tried in the second trial for aggravated robbery from the same case. And my defense attorney came to me and said, look, the DA is willing to make an offer, something they hadn't done before, which I never would have agreed to anyway, but they were willing to give me a 20-year non-aggravated sentence if I would plead guilty. So with a 20-year non-aggravated sentence, I could have done 2 years and been eligible for parole. And so at that time, I'm telling my lawyer, you know, I'm not going to take any time for something I didn't do. He said, well, you should think about it. I said, there's nothing to think about. I didn't commit this offense, and I'm not taking any time for it. I said, they could offer me a day, and I wouldn't take it because I didn't commit the offense. And again, he suggested that I think about it, even encouraged me to talk to my wife and mother about it before I made a final decision. I said, well, I really don't need to talk to anybody. But I went ahead and talked to my mother and my wife because I thought they would have supported my decision. And of course, upon telling them that they were willing to give me 20 years non-aggravated, both my mother and my wife said, hey, we know you're innocent, but we just want you to come home. We think you should take the plea bargain. I was like, what? I said, I can't do this. And they was like, well, we understand you're innocent, but we just want you to come home. And so I began to explain to them the ramifications of me pleading guilty to something that I did not do. So I explained to them that here's the reality of my situation. I say, if I plead guilty to this crime that I didn't commit, I say the first thing is I'm going to have an X on my back once I do this. I say, but the whole reality is you just don't accept a plea bargain without giving a statement of omission. to where I have to admit that I did something that I did not do. So I have to formulate a lie, first of all, to say that I committed this offense. And then, once I do the time and I make parole, I say, now I have an X on my back, so I'm a target. I say the next time that the investigators can't find a suspect, then I'm the scapegoat. I say, I'm setting a cycle. I said, so I just can't do that. And both my mother and wife said, well, we didn't think about it that way. So we understand, do what you believe is right to do. So again, we took it to trial with the hopes of the truth prevailing this time around. And of course, that didn't happen.
You were given life.
Yes.
Could you tell us about, I mean, many people would have been really angry. I'm sure you felt angry too, but can you tell us about how the decision you made in solitary to get on top of, to somehow not become angry and bitter?
So upon my arrest, of course, I was never angry. However, I was frustrated with the fact that the investigators seemingly didn't care about the truth. They didn't care that I was innocent. They only wanted to point the finger at someone. So I was a little frustrated by that. And ultimately, I wound up on a tank with 7 other guys. And some of the guys in jail, you encounter guys who feel that they're running everything on the tank. You know, they control everything. And I've never been the type of person who like to be pushed or ran over. So I was having these altercations with these guys to the point of, and sometimes it didn't come to be physical. It was just words between 2 guys. And I guess some of the words I had with one guy, he was kind of upset and had, not to me, but he told the guards that he was going to cut my throat. And so they took me down to talk to the commander, and the commander decided that I was hogging everybody and not the other way around. And so I wound up in solitary confinement. Now, of course, before I went to solitary confinement, I had started reading the Bible and trying to grasp an understanding of what God would have or would be saying to me. And while in solitary, you know, I was only supposed to be there 7 days, and because the commander told me if I stayed out of trouble, he would release me in 7 days. However, despite the fact that I stayed out of trouble, didn't cause any trouble, I wound up staying there for something like 45 to maybe 60 days. I think they forgot about me. But the good thing was, while in solitary, I was able to draw a closer, more deeper, and meaningful relationship with God, to the point that I began to question my actions while in jail. I began to question, why did I feel I had to prove something to someone? You know, why was I allowing pride to get in the way? You know, I don't have to prove that I can beat up somebody or none of those things. And I began to realize, you know, I'm a grown man. I'm not a child anymore. I don't have to fight anybody. And so I began to develop an inner peace while in solitary confinement. And when I was released from solitary confinement, after I had been convicted the second time, I wound up on a tank and was able to coexist with people. And I encountered some more bullies, but I was able to just look past them and stay out of trouble.
You said that you've said that you were free in prison. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is the fact that, to me, to stand on the truth is liberating. So despite the fact that I had been wrongfully convicted twice of a crime that I didn't commit, I knew the truth, and I knew that God knew the truth. So in that, I was liberated. I was free. There was no guilt or any shame associated with me being convicted by a jury, because I knew the truth. God knew the truth. And to be honest, I truly believe that the investigator and the DA knew the truth. However, I don't think they wanted to focus on it. Yes.
So this story, this book, is about the law and the broken system, but it's also about faith. Faith is a big theme And one of the people who was very faithful, just to take a second of your time here, sorry, Ben, is Jim McCluskey. And Jim McCluskey is the father of the modern innocence movement. He was getting people out of prison, reinvestigating wrongful or dubious convictions from 1983, 10 years before the Innocence Project was even formed. The thing about Jim McCluskey is he was a Vietnam vet who went to Princeton Seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, and it's a 3-year degree, and during the fall of his second year, he began volunteering at Trenton State Prison. And while he was there, he met a lot of guys, obviously, but one guy named Chiefy. And Chiefy kept insisting it was innocent. Now, this is like 1980. And so Jim's like, come on, if you're in prison, you're guilty, right? That's what people thought back then. If you're in prison, you're guilty. And Chiefy every week would just not stop talking about how he was innocent. And so finally, Chiefy said, look, Jim, will you just take my trial transcript and read it over Thanksgiving break? And Jim said, okay, yeah, sure. So he did that. He read the transcript, and he goes back the next week, and Chiefy says, so, Jim, what do you think? And Jim said, well, Chiefy, I think you may be innocent. And Chiefy said, well, what are you going to do about it? Jim said, what do you mean, what am I going to do about it? I'm a seminarian, for Pete's sake. And he said, well, you can't just go back to your little dorm room and pray. God uses humans, and you're the only human I have. So Jim took the next year off from January of 81 to December of 81 from seminary, reinvestigated, never having done anything, kind of going up the scariest parts of the city and talking to informants and talking to everyone, police, everyone, and found enough evidence to show that the state star witness and the snitch had been lying, and the prosecutors knew about it. Got the case before a federal judge. The judge ruled that Chiefy was innocent, and Chiefy walked out of prison. This is one of the first times it had happened. So Jim finishes his degree, and he realizes that his call is not to the pulpit. His call is to the wrongly convicted. And he called this little nonprofit that he started with $10,000 from his parents, he called it Centurion Ministries, for the centurion who's sitting at the bottom of the cross and looks up and says, surely this one was innocent. So Centurion Ministries came into your life, and we're going to go briefly through. I hope you guys, I'm not saying that you need to buy the book. It would be great, but take it out of the library, whatever you want, but you've got to read the story. So we're gonna go a little bit ahead in time because we're gonna run out of time. So the 1990s, you were there in the 1990s. It was a rough decade, but you had hope because of Jim McCluskey. Can you just tell about that?
Well, I had heard of Centurion Ministries because of some cases that they were involved in. For instance, Joyce Ann Brown's case. I had read about it in the newspaper. However, when you read an article, only thing you see is the organization, Centurion Ministries, no contact information. So I went to prison, and going to the chapel all the time, to church programs, I encountered this guy by the name of James Rayos. And I would talk about my case with anybody, about my innocence, and he and I were discussing our case one time. He was telling me about his innocence, and he told me, look, I'm going to give you an address, and I want you to write them. He said, I've wrote them, but they couldn't help me because I don't have enough time. They only help people who have a lot of time, because by the time they get around to your case, you've probably already gotten out. So he passed on this information to me, and it was the address of Centurion Ministries. So December of 1989, I wrote Centurion Ministries, and they were one of the hundreds of organizations I had written, but probably one of the 3 that had written me back. And they remained consistent in writing me back, but one of their first letters kind of explained the fact that they're a small organization, and that they receive thousands of requests every month of people professing to be innocent. So they began to explain to me, look, don't stop writing other people because the chance of us getting around to you is very slim. So, of course, but they stayed consistent in responding to my letters. They would write me and ask questions about my case, and I'd write them back. And then they'd write me back and ask me something else, and I'd return the letter. But they remained consistent with me. And in 2000, Jim McCluskey came down, which was 11 years later, and visited me and asked me, Ben, do you know why I'm here? And I'm like, yeah, you want to know about my case? You want to talk about my case? He said, yeah, that's why I'm here. And he asked me that about 3 or 4 times. And upon the 4th time, he said, okay, let me explain it to you. He said, the reason I'm here is because I never accept a case without sitting down and meeting the individual. He said, so I'm here to let you know that from this day forward, you are now a client of Centurion Ministries, and we won't stop fighting for you until we walk you out. And so that was 2000, and they really stood behind me until they walked me out in 2021.
Jim, one of the things that happened, I mean, he renewed your hope, but one of the things that had happened in the 1990s was that you asked Deborah, your wife, for a divorce so that she could move on with her life and raise your son with someone else if she wanted to. And she briefly, for like 5 minutes, married someone else and then realized that you were the love of her life. And so back in the early 2000s, you began writing each other. So you had this hope. You had this hope because Jim McCluskey had taken your case, and you also had this kind of hope because Deborah was back in your life. And I'm going to ask you to read something that you wrote to her because it is one of the most perplexing letters. I've read through about 2,000 letters of Ben's to Deborah, and they were all astonishing, but this one was completely perplexing, and I could never do this. Okay, so it starts there.
Okay. In the event that anything should happen to me, I don't want you or BJ to be consumed with hate or bitterness. I don't want either of you to demand justice, that justice be served. Bitterness and hatred are like a cancer. They will eat away at you until they destroy. It's just like my accusers. I don't hold any ill feelings toward any of them. I hate the fact that they lied on me, but I don't hate any of them. Vengeance is mine, said the Lord, I will repay. Oftentimes, we want to put ourselves in the place of God and take matters into our own hands. What a shame, because we'll have to give an account of our sins one day. What I want you to do for me is simple. Be at peace, because it is far more rewarding.
So Ben, how on earth did you get to that place?
I believe in a loving God who truly wants us to do what he has called us and commanded us to do. One of the things I share with people all the time is something that Jesus said, and it is where he's speaking to, he said, ye have heard that it had been said to love your neighbors. He said, but I say unto you, love your enemies, do good to those who despitefully use you and persecute you. So I believe that to be not a request that Jesus made of us, but I believe it to be a command, and it truly is. And so until we begin to love one another, we're truly not serving our Lord and our Savior.
I'm going to go quickly through what happened over the next few years. Is that Jim McCluskey got evidence that Ben had not received a fair trial, that the witnesses were lying, that there was another more viable suspect. They got that evidence in front of a judge, a Dallas judge, Rick Magnus. And Rick Magnus heard all this evidence and then found that Ben should be released because he was actually innocent. But in Texas, a judge can't just release someone. In Texas, you have to go, the high criminal court in Texas, called the Court of Criminal Appeals, has to agree with the finding. And they waited 3 years, and they said, you know what? No, sorry, Ben, there's no DNA. You know, we just we don't believe it. So you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. So after getting this false hope that you would be released, and then this was decimated, this hope. And in fact, you would need to have, someone would need to find more evidence of your innocence for you to get back into court again. How did you cope with that? How did you do it? How did you cope in that was 2011. For the next few years, how did you cope?
Basically, because I believe that in the end, truth prevails regardless to our circumstances. Despite the fact that I was still incarcerated, I was at least hopeful because the truth had been revealed. However, the courts failed to acknowledge it. And I want to be clear about something. Yes, in Texas, the high court have the last say, but at the same time, had the district attorney gotten on board in that hearing where the judge made the recommendation that I be granted relief, I could have gotten out, but because the state was opposed, I had to remain behind bars until a court of criminal appeals made a ruling on the case. So with that, I was always hopeful that at some point that the DA's office would acknowledge the truth and that they would get on board. And so I just remained hopeful that one day that something more compelling would be found that will get them on board.
So Jim McCluskey told me that it would take a miracle to get you out after that. And he said, look, the only way that Ben is going to get out is if someone confesses to the crime, and he didn't think we'd find new evidence, or if the parole board grants you parole. And you could have gotten parole, probably. Why not? Why didn't you?
Well, in Texas, the parole board they want a person to have accountability. And so the Texas Parole Board, in order to make parole, one of the requirements is that you, first of all, admit guilt and have remorse for the offense for which you have been charged. And being that I am and was innocent of the case, I could never admit to it, nor could I ever have remorse for it. I would always go in and tell them, I sympathize with the family and their loss. However, I can't be remorseful for something I did not do. And so year after year, from 2007 up until 2021, I was being denied parole.
You and I met in 2017 when you were still in prison. I was doing a story for The Atlantic and NPR, and I'm not going to talk about it. It was, I should just say, the most meaningful thing I've ever done in my life is to work on this story and to work on something where you believe you're on the side of the angels, because it was clear to me that Ben Spencer was innocent. And along with a private investigator who donated his time for free, we found some new evidence. We found 2 of the 4 witnesses recanted, and we found a new alibi witness as well, and presented that. We found the evidence. I wrote up everything, and in The Atlantic and NPR, and unfortunately, nothing happened after that because it didn't have any legal weight. And here's a miracle that occurred. The miracle that occurred was that a new prosecutor, John Creusot, was elected in November of 2018. And he looked at our evidence and all the evidence beforehand and decided to take a serious look at Ben's case, which had never happened. There had been 4 other DAs who had heard about the case, and Jim and his lawyer, Cheryl Watley, had presented it to the DAs, and none of them would listen to it. But you ended up getting out, and we're not going to tell you about that, but I would tell you all about that. You'll have to read about it in the book. But there's something that happened. You walked out in 2021 because the prosecutor supported the idea that you didn't get a fair trial. Not that he was innocent, it wasn't that, because they had already failed at that, proving the innocence. They decided to go for a lower standard, just that he didn't get a fair trial. And then eventually, in April, on August 29th of 2024, just three months ago, Ben Spencer was exonerated. He was declared innocent. His name was cleared, and there is no smell of smoke upon him for all of those who know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's completely cleared. Can you describe that hearing, and I actually wrote down the words that you said at that hearing, but can you just describe like the feeling of that hearing on that morning?
Of course, it was most definitely one of the most exciting days of my life. I mean, we didn't know what the DA would do, how he would resolve this case, because there are several things he could have done. He could have just dismissed it, which means it would just release me from the charges. But he actually, or he could have retried the case, which he had every right to do, but he chose to take the third route, and that was to fully exonerate me of the charges. And so it was an invigorated day in that upon that day, my name was cleared. Not only did he and his office apologize to me, but the judge presiding over the hearing came down from the bench and walked around and stood in front of me, signed a paper, shook my hand, and said she wanted to be the first person to shake the hand of an innocent man. And so it was just an exciting day.
It was a little bit like a Disney movie. The crowd, the courtroom held 70 people, was supposed to hold 70 people. There were probably 200 people there. Finally, the judge had to kick a bunch of them out. We were still, I mean, people were sitting in the jury box, people were standing in the aisles, people were squeezed in on a bench that should have held 6. They had 12, everyone kind of trying to kind of wedge in like pieces of a puzzle. And the prosecutor who reinvestigated the case began to cry. She choked up when she apologized on the behalf of the state of Texas for what they put you through. But then Ben got a chance to speak. And Ben, I've written down your words, and I just wonder if you would mind reading them and what you're thinking at the very bottom.
Okay. And this was truly felt from my heart. I ask that we don't forget I ask that we don't forget that myself and my family were not the only victims in this. The Young family were victims as well because they lost a loved one. And the person who was actually responsible for what happened to Jeffrey Young was not brought to justice. So I'd ask that you pray for the Young family and be mindful of them. I don't want them to be forgotten in this.
Just 2 other questions, because I'd love to open it up. One other question. So, have you thought about it? What is the purpose of this unjust experience that you've had? More than half your life was taken from you. You couldn't raise your son. You lost, for a while, you lost Deborah. How do you make sense of it in God's plan?
I truly believe that God has a purpose for all of us. Sometimes the things we encounter in life, they would either tear us down or build us up. In this case, I think I was built up. I truly believe that God built me up in this. I have a better understanding of my purpose in life, I hope, and I want to at least stand up to the call for what God has called me for.
If I may we're going to open this up for questions, but if I can just say one one thing. The reason I'm just so glad you guys are here. We this morning we talked to the law school, and we have a second target audience, law students, because they can change the system in the future, but also our second kind of audience that we wanted to reach, or at least I wanted to reach, are people of faith. And, you know, my sense is that kind of right now, faith and politics are very much intertwined. So almost people in the same church who follow the same Savior sometimes can't share a meal, right? That has just become really, really, really complicated. And as I've thought about this, and I covered religion for NPR for a long time, as I've thought about all of the kind of messiness of faith and politics, what I came to realize, for myself at least, is that faith is pretty simple. It's pretty hard, but it's pretty simple. And what I've done is just to kind of dip into the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, and also Jesus' words, and to just realize how simple it is, how simple God's commands are. I mean, he says, feed the hungry, heal the sick, welcome the stranger, defend the destitute. For me, it was trying to bring justice to a man who was wrongly accused, but also tell the larger story of how broken the system is, but it can be fixed. So for me, that's what it was. It was very simple. It was a very, what I think of as a stripped down faith. It doesn't rely on politics or doctrinal purity. It relies on Micah's question, which is, what does the Lord require of you? But to act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And so I'm so grateful that you guys are here. And I guess I'm encouraging everyone here to think about, what is that kind of simple, apolitical thing that God wants you to do, or all of us to do? So I'm really thankful that you all came and sat and heard Ben's story. And should we do questions?
Well, hello, thank you. Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Barb, for sharing your story. I'm Eden. I'm with the Legal Vocation Fellowship, and I'm just here to ask some of your questions. So let's start with, you felt like the truth would prevail, Ben, but what did you do when you feel like it didn't? Did you lose hope at any time?
Not at all. Again, despite the fact of my situation, I felt liberated in the fact that I was innocent. And so whether I was incarcerated or not, I truly believe that God was working in my life. One of the things I share with people is I started off asking this question of myself, why is this happening to me? But as time drew on, I began to ask myself, why not me? You know, who am I that I am any better than anyone else, that they should be in the situation that I was in? And I consider what Jesus went through for my sake. He suffered wrongfully for my sake. So am I any better than him to suffer wrongfully? So with that, I just truly believe that God was in my life and that he was working. And despite whether man ever accepted the fact that I was innocent or not, I knew that God knew the truth, and I knew the truth, and I was happy with that.
Can you talk a little bit more about your faith? Was this just something that you felt from day one of being in prison? Was it something that built up over time? Were there things in your childhood that kind of brought you to that place, or was it something that developed as you were spending time in prison?
Well, probably a combination of all of that. Because I grew up going to church, and I remember scripture that says, train up a child in the way it should go, and when it is old, it will not depart from it. So when this happened, it kind of brought me back to my faith that I had as a child, trusting and believing in God. Also, I'm a firm believer that you know, bad things happen to good people, and we have to know that. You know, we would like to believe that because we serve God, that everything's going to be well with us. But, you know, one of the things that Jesus said, I mean, he said so many profound things, but one that stands out right now is the fact that he said, in the world you'll have tribulation, and that spoke to me. He didn't say I was going to have a good time. He didn't say everything was going to go my way. But he told me that in the world I'm going to have tribulation, but I could be of good cheer, for just as he overcame, I too shall overcome. Maybe not in this life, but in the next I could truly overcome if I stay true and stay committed to him.
Well, Barb, during this all, what was your faith like? What did you feel when kind of Ben kept being denied parole, or you kind of saw that Jim had his first go of it and it was denied, and now it's your turn to come to bat?
Yeah, I actually felt really called to Ben's story in a way that, I've done thousands of stories for NPR and for The Atlantic, or for the Christian Science Monitor before that. But this one felt different. When I first talked to Jim, I called up Jim and I said, Jim, what's the case that haunts you? And he said, well, that's easy, Ben Spencer's case, and told me about it. And I remember when I covered the Justice Department for NPR, I will get to your question. When I covered the Justice Department for NPR, one of the things that really galvanized me, that I felt was so important to report on, were wrongful convictions. And so there was this internal kind of compass for me, this internal passion about that, that I think God puts passions in all of us, right? And so when I called Jim and he told me about Ben's case, I just had this sense that I was being called to it. And so what I did next is I called up the judge, because I knew I needed to speak to him. I knew he wouldn't speak to me. I knew I had to ask for the interview. And so I called up the judge, Judge Magnus, who had found him to be innocent. And I said to his clerk, I need to put in an interview with the judge, and can you tell me how I do that? Do I write an email, or do I call the PR people, or what do I do? And she said, just a second, please. And then I heard this, hello. And I'm like, whoa, Judge Magnus, hey. I'm Barb Bradley Hagerty. I'm doing a story for The Atlantic. You probably don't remember this case, but I'm looking at the Ben Spencer case. It was 10 years ago, I know. And he said, and I said, could I get an interview? And he said, well, when do you want to do the interview? And I said, next few days? And he said, well, that's very interesting, because on Monday, this is like a Thursday, on Monday I retire, and then 15 days after that, I become a roving judge, one that substitutes. And so he said, so for 15 days or 14 days, I won't be a judge. And I said, well, all right, how about next week then, when you're not a judge? When I hung up, I really felt that this was, I'm not superstitious, I don't like, but I felt like this was a confirmation that this was a call. And the more, I'll tell you, the more I worked on Ben's story, even though we weren't sure of the outcome, we really didn't know if he would get out. Maybe he's infectious. I just had a sense that the truth would prevail in this case. I didn't know. It was before we found new evidence. We didn't know if any DA would listen to it, but there was so much prayer going on. Deborah, his wife, is a strong Christian. Ben's praying. Jim McCluskey's praying. I'm praying. It was like, the justice system didn't have a chance, right, with all that prayer going on. And so it did strengthen my faith, and as I said, I felt this stripped down faith, in the sense that I was just going to focus very simply on one thing I knew God wanted me to do, and that was to visit the prisoner, to help the destitute, to help someone who couldn't help himself. And so that became the center of what I was doing, of my faith, and it worked out.
Well, Ben, can you tell us a little bit about the first time you met Barb and what you thought of her?
Oh dear, I've never heard this one.
Well, I thought she was interesting. She was a little short lady, and I didn't know how much impact she would have, but I was quite moved by the fact that she took an interest in my case, and that she was willing to report on it, which it could have several impacts. I mean, it could have a negative impact or a positive impact because my case had been reported on so many times, and the reporting seemed to have had a negative effect in the past. And so I didn't know how that would turn out, but I was hoping that it would turn out great, and it did.
And Barb, you spent so much time with Ben. What is something that most people wouldn't know about him, or something you would want people to know about him?
He loves cars. He does. Actually, what you should know about Ben, which everyone knows who knows him, is that most prisoners, most exonerees, I don't know if it's most, but all the ones that I've met have been institutionalized, which means that they've spent so much time in prison. When they get out, they almost don't know how to handle life. So for example, one of his friends, Richard Miles, didn't know how to use a knife and fork because he had been using a spork for so many years. He'd just forgotten how to use a knife and fork. Or prisoners feel like they need to, ask permission to have a cup of coffee or to go for a walk or to do whatever. They just feel like they just need to check things because they haven't been able to make their own choices for so long. Ben had none of that. Ben came out, and I remember standing, this is remarkable, and I remember standing the next morning after he was let out, not before he was exonerated, but after he was let out in 2021, and we were standing outside, and there was such a kind of feeling of normalcy. It was Dallas in the spring, and there were lawnmowers, and people walking by with dogs, and just kind of the normal stuff that you and I would take for granted. And suddenly I was seeing all this through Ben's eyes, and it must have been a shock, right? And I said, Ben, what is this like for you to see all this and to be free and to get up and do whatever you want? And you said, do you remember about coma? About the coma?
Oh, yeah. Well, what I told Barb is this: it's like I woke up out of a coma and just walked back into my life. It wasn't like, for me, I was walked down to a room, and I took off a jail uniform and put on a suit and walked out. And as soon as I walked out of the room with that suit on, it was like those 34 years just vanished, and that I just woke up out of a coma and walked back into my life. And to be honest, I have to really recall what I went through for the 34 years of my incarceration.
So someone who's been by your side the whole time is your wife, Deborah, who's here with us today. Can you just talk a little bit about what she had meant to you throughout that time and the role that she really played in your life?
Well, it was good to have her support, for sure. We had, like I said, just encountered getting married, looking forward to having our first child and raising him, and to be just kind of snatched away from them, abruptly, and not to be the father, not to be the husband that I had hoped to be. That was very impactful in my life. However, to have her with me, someone that I could still talk to, I could still communicate through letters. Late on in time, they added phones to the prison system in Texas, so I was able to call her on the phone, and we would talk. Despite the fact that we were divorced, we still had a good relationship. So to have her support, to have her there, to at least communicate with her and to be a part of her life in some way, it was very meaningful to me to have her there.
And then, a year after you got out, right?
Yes. Barb wanted to spoil everything.
Oh, and then and then what happened? You get out, and what happened?
So, as I mentioned earlier, Deborah and I, we got married January 10th, 1987, 2 months prior to me being arrested and charged with this offense, and 2 months prior to my son being born. So, in March 12th, 2021, I was released on a personal recognizance bond by Judge Leila Mays, and Deborah and I just picked up where we left off, and January 10th, 2022, we remarried. We recommitted our vows and ourselves to each other. You know, on the original day, we had been married 34 years previously. 35 years previously.
And actually, there's a scene. It was the middle of COVID, and yet 500 people came to the wedding. And there's a scene that a kind of a scene that's seared into my memory. I was standing at the back, and I was looking up at the wedding party, at the altar, and 5 of the men, including Ben, 4 of his groomsmen and Ben, had all been in prison. 4 of the 5 had been wrongly convicted, which just tells you how common. I'm not saying 4 out of 5 prisoners are innocent, but what I'm saying is that that's a lot of mistakes for one altar. And all of those men, you know, they are the luckiest of the unlucky, because all of those men, including Ben, had people who fought for them. Jim McCluskey spent $250,000 on Ben's investigation. People donated their time. There were 2 attorneys, Jim McCluskey and Daryl Parker, a private investigator. The media cared. There were a lot of people rooting for them, and had any of those people not been involved, any one of the 5 of us, Ben would still be in prison right now. And so he is the luckiest of the unlucky. Those other men were also the luckiest of the unlucky. But I guess I wonder, you know, in America, should a person's freedom depend on luck?
Yeah, we'll get more to that later. There are definitely some questions about what people can do. But I'm curious, Ben, you kind of said something about while you're in prison, you weren't really able to be the husband that you thought you wanted to be. So can you just talk a little bit about the fact, like, how did you think about your role as, like, father and husband while you were kind of locked away? And, like, those are the things that you are. And, like, how did you kind of reconceive, like, how am I a father to my son, and how am I a husband to Deb?
Well, part of the reason why we divorced was because I didn't think I could be the husband that I should be, which is a provider, someone who's there when she needs me to be. As a father, I thought I should be there for my son to help raise him, to instill in him qualities that I would like for him to have. And it's kind of, you know, you kind of do it through visits, but it's not the same because you're not there. You have no control over what they can or can't do. And for my son, of course, his mother, you know, and understandably, she was super protective of him, so she sheltered him pretty much his whole life. So there were things he wanted to do as a child that I couldn't trump her on because I was incarcerated. So, like, he wanted to play sports, and she's like, I'm not a sports mom. He's going to get out there, and he's going to get hurt. And I'm like, he's a boy. He's supposed to get hurt. You know, he'll bounce back, and he'll get up, but she wasn't having it. So, Deborah,
we're giving Deb equal time
Deborah,
at the end, right?
Yeah, but Deborah, she was a good mother, and she raised him right. And thankfully, you know, my son, in some cases, he could have followed in the wrong path because I wasn't there. But thankfully, you know, thank God that he didn't.
And I should just say, like, I would get calls from Ben after he was out, and he'd be just riding around, you know, going to Burger King with his son, BJ, and they were just having a grand old time. And they became best friends, as Deb talked about. Your relationship like that was re-cemented, so to speak. And Deb has been kind of you have a great time. But she's been, look, he doesn't say it. I said it earlier today. I've read all the letters. He was head over heels. I didn't read her letters because they were destroyed. He was head over heels and is head over heels in love with Deborah. So even though he tries to act cool about it, this is a guy who's in love.
Well, something about your past, too, is that I think when you were younger, you thought you'd be a pastor. So kind of like, how did that like manifest like in your time at prison? Like someone asked, like, did you like start ministering, or how did you really encounter God? Because it's clear that your faith was there, but what was that experience like?
Well, as a child, like I said, I grew up in church. My dad, in fact, he wasn't a minister of a church, however, he used to minister at our church, as well as we would go out of town. He would minister at the churches where we went out of town. And I've always admired someone who could minister and preach the word of God, to the point that I said, hey, that's something I would like to do one day. And so when I found myself in this situation, back to the question, I would ask myself, why is this happening? And not saying that God was speaking to me, but my conscience would always say, you said when you grew up you was going to be a preacher, and I wasn't going to church when this happened. I still believed in God. I still had my faith, but I just wasn't going to church, and I wasn't living up to what I would say a Christian is supposed to be. So in asking that question and hearing my conscience say, well, you said when you grew up you was going to be a preacher. So I wrote the chaplain and asked for a Bible, and he sent me a Bible. And of course, when I first started reading it, it was like I was just reading it, and I was a bunch of words coming off a page, and I was getting no understanding, no enlightenment. And so the more I read and was encountering that experience, I began to pray about that. I was like, well, God, if this is what you want for me, then open my understanding, help me, enlighten me through your word. And I began to pray that consistently. And the more I prayed it and read the Bible and studied the Bible, the more I began to realize that God was truly able to speak to me through his word, and I began to develop a relationship and understanding of him that I had never had before. And so one of the things I try to encourage people as well is not to say that we have no need for a pastor or a minister, but we truly have a need to study the word of God for ourselves, so we can have a better understanding of what it is God would have us to do as an individual.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we have some questions too. This is like kind of for the both of you. How many incarcerated people do you believe are innocent? And like maybe to you specifically, Ben, like did you talk to anyone during your time there that you thought was innocent? And like how do you feel like now that maybe some of them are still there and you're out here?
Yes, many of them. For certain, I've spoke to some people who profess to be innocent, some of whom were exonerated before I was. Richard Miles, Johnny Pinchback, Charles Chapman, Courage, Stephen Phillips, Christopher Scott. I mean, on the unit I came off of, there's at least 10 guys that I know who were found not guilty or were exonerated. And there are others who we have left behind who I believe to be innocent. And so to get a number, I would say anywhere from 3 to 4 out of 10 are innocent of the crimes by which they've been convicted.
So there's been 3,600 exonerations that we know about since 1989. A lot of them have DNA. It's easy to exonerate someone with DNA. Most people in prison, there is no DNA. There's no way, that's why it took 34 years to exonerate Ben. There's kind of no easy, all the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, so to speak. And so there are a lot of people in prison innocent people in prison who can never prove their innocence because there's no forensic evidence to help them. I've heard estimates of, 1 to 3% of the prison population, which is more than, I think, what is it? More than 2 million, right? Something like that. So that's a lot of people. The other thing I would say is that all the DNA cases, the old cases where the DNA has not been tested and now can be tested and you can get them out, those cases are basically done. Either the person has died, the person has been exonerated, the person has gotten out of prison, but there's no low-hanging fruit, again, to pluck. And so from now on, what we're going to be seeing is cases where there isn't forensic evidence, you know, drive-by shooting. You know, lots of cases, lots of violent crimes actually don't have forensic evidence. And so what we're going to see is more and more of those cases without DNA, and it's going to take the kind of hard investigation that Jim McCluskey did to be able to get those people out. And it's a slog. How many of those people will we be able to get out? I mean, many of the 3,600 got out because of DNA. So it's just going to get harder and harder and harder. But how many people are in prison who are innocent? You know, 1% to 3%. That's what I understand.
So I think a lot of people also kind of have the question of like, now what can we do? We've heard this story. I'm just an average person. Am I supposed to go out and start investigating, or just what can the everyday person do just in response to this?
So there is something that you all can do, actually. There are, well, ironically, Texas has become the most progressive state in the nation when it comes to wrongful convictions and giving people access to the courts if they believe they've been wrongly convicted. So Texas, you know, Texas used to have the worst record, especially back then, but they execute people. So they're like, maybe we want to make sure we don't execute someone who's innocent. And so they've put in guardrails, especially after DNA began to show how consistently innocent people are convicted. DNA showed that the system was really broken. And so what happened is Texas began to think, what can we do to prevent innocent people from being convicted? Like, we're going to be really skeptical of jailhouse informants. We're going to really test out the eyewitness testimony, their memory, all of that stuff. We're going to look at incentivized witnesses. We're just going to try, we're going to have cameras so that police can't coerce a confession. We're just going to do these things to try to prevent wrongful convictions. And then on the other side, they are by far the most liberal, progressive state when it comes to giving someone access to the courts if they make a case that they're innocent. They have a conviction integrity unit, which is a unit within the prosecutor's office where prosecutors will reinvestigate a dubious conviction. And they can get stuff that I can't get, that defense attorneys can't get. They can go into the files and look at this case. And that's what they did in Ben's case, and found evidence that the star witness had lied not just about $580 in reward, but up to $10,000 in reward, and lied about it. So Texas is really good. How did that happen? Well, one way it happened is that the courts had to, take a hard look at how they may be on the way to executing an innocent person. But also the legislature put in a lot of guardrails. And everyone can do that. All you need to do is, in your state, in this state, what you need to do is just think, are there wrongful convictions? Is there a state legislator that you can contact or write? Is there a case that needs to be looked at? People can actually change the system, and it's changing in Texas, and it's changing other places too. So there is something that ordinary people can do. Unlike, if you don't want to be a Jim McCluskey and go out there and, investigate in really scary places, then you can just contact your local legislators.
Yeah, I would say be involved, get engaged. Just as we were sitting up here speaking, I guess I feel some conviction because of the fact that, you're asking the question about people who are actually innocent, who are still in prison. And one case came to mind just now. Back in August, myself and 3 other exonerees, we went down to Anderson County in Texas, where to kind of help support the defense team of this guy by the name of Robert Robeson. And he's on death row right now, and would have been executed last month if not for the legislators who did something that had never been done before. And what they did was they subpoenaed him to appear before them to testify on the day he was supposed to be executed. So that...
Or the day after, I think.
No, the day of.
Day of, okay.
And because they did that, you know, the governor of Texas and the attorney general of Texas fought them on it. They said they had no right, no place to do that. In fact, he would have been executed if not for their savvy attempt, and which worked. But the end hasn't came in that case, because he still can be executed if a court doesn't step in or the governor change his position to say, you know, I believe he's innocent, and pardon him or give him a reprieve. He could still be executed. So, I mean, he's on death row because of shaken baby syndrome, which his conviction was based on what they call junk science now. There's no evidence to support what they put him on death row for, but yet he's there and could have been executed.
And there's a case where the public rose up in outrage that this guy was about to be executed based on junk science, and contacted their legislators. And who knows, I hope he's not executed, but he may be. But he may also not be.
Yeah, so it seems like, I mean, obviously we pray, but then we also use our voices and speak out against the injustice that we see. Just like a kind of as a closing word, do you guys have anything else like on your mind or on your heart or in your spirit that you just want to share? I'll start with you, Barb, and then go to you, Ben.
Actually, I already shared it, which is some things, well, no, let's just put it, something like this. There are certain issues that are immune to politics. And one of them is wrongful convictions. And the reason is doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal, no one wants to see an innocent person go to prison. For one thing, the guilty person's out there still committing crimes, which happened in Ben's case. So there are certain things that are devoid of politics, and I think it takes people with a strong moral compass and a real faith to get behind those things and do whatever the passion is that you have, that you feel morally convicted to do, to follow up on. I think, you know, that's what you should be doing, is following what God has very simply told you to do.
And I would say, have faith always. Trust in God. God works. He never leaves nor forsakes. Even when life troubles seem to be winning, God is still in control, and he's still present and in your life.
Okay, join me in thanking Ben and Barb for coming here today.
And thank you for having us.